So this talk is going to look at the key fatal errors that the mighty revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg made and the consequences of those mistakes for revolution in Europe. And in looking at these errors, I hope you can learn from them to better fight in the struggles that we fight today and confront the gargantuan multiple crises that we face, the genocide in Gaza, global warming, economic misery, racism, and so on. But before I talk about her mistakes, it feels necessary to first confirm Luxemburg's position as one of the most important figures of the Marxist tradition. Because as Lenin said in her memory, Rosa Luxemburg was mistaken. She was mistaken, but in spite of her mistakes, she was and remains for us an eagle. So Rosa Luxemburg joined the illegal proletariat party in Poland at the age of 15. She left Poland for Germany during a crackdown and dedicated the rest of her life to the struggle. She became one of the sharpest and most respected political leaders in Poland and Germany by her late 20s, and she was a revolutionary committed to building struggle and power from below with every bone in her body for her entire life. She was a brilliant orator, despite being very short and slight. She was also a brilliant writer, and her writings are still enormously relevant and useful for us today around the nature of the mass strike, the centrality of war and the arms industry to capitalism, over the question of reform and revolution, and particularly her arguments about not just the desirability but the necessity of revolution, and that capitalism produced the conditions for either socialism or barbarism. And we now know that how right she was when the events after her death ultimately led to the barbarism of fascism and the Holocaust. And it must also be said that Rosa Luxemburg was one of many brilliant Jewish radicals who would absolutely turn in their graves at the idea that Israel and Zionism represented the interests of Jews around the world. And there's a line from her anti-war pamphlet, the Junius pamphlet, that's never felt so relevant as it does in the context of the slaughter in Gaza, when the veneer of respectability, of liberalism, and the so-called rules-based order has crumbled completely. Mass slaughter has become the tiresome and monotonous business of the day, and the end is no closer, she wrote. Violated, dishonoured, wading in blood, dripping filth. There stands bourgeois society. This is it in reality. Not all spick and span and moral with pretentious to culture, philosophy, ethics, order, peace, and the rule of law, but the ravening beast, the witch's Sabbath of anarchy, a plague to culture and humanity. Thus, it reveals itself in its naked form. I don't think anyone can capture the barbarity of capitalism quite like Rosa. So Luxemburg had been predicting the coming war for over a decade and preparing the working class in Europe to oppose it. When she wrote these lines from jail in 1915, the full extent of the carnage of the First World War still wasn't most clear to most people. In 1914, the continent had been whipped up into a kind of patriotic frenzy by ruling classes needing the support of their populations, who were to be used as fodder in the imperialist war machine. What Luxemburg didn't expect was that her own party, the German Social Democrats, or the SPD, would vote to support the war in 1914. The SPD was the biggest working class party in the world at the time, with over 1 million members. All the major unions were a part of it. And the vote went against the 1907 resolution of the Socialist International to oppose war when it arrived. Its leaders like Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein were the European left's most influential theorists at the time. And so central was the principle of opposition to war in Marxist theory that when Lenin read the news about the SPD supporting it, he initially thought it was a forgery. He didn't believe it. But what Luxemburg had failed to see until it was far too late was the need to break completely with the reformist party that she was critiquing and to establish an independent revolutionary party of the kind that existed in Russia with the Bolsheviks. And this was a mistake that she would end up paying with for her life in 1919 when her murder was ordered by the leaders of the party that she had been a member of for 17 years. So the German Revolution started in 1918 and continued for almost 5 years after Luxemburg's death until 1924. It raised the possibility again and again of overthrowing the capitalist order and creating socialism, but without a revolutionary organisation that had deep roots in the working class and could confidently lead it through the vicissitudes and winds of struggle, lead the strikes and the workers' councils, and argue against the reformists' constant attempts to rein it all in. It ultimately foundered on the rocks alongside the Russian Revolution. And I think, unlike the Russian Revolution, which is maybe one of the most studied events in history by historians and theorists of all political stripes, the German Revolution is relatively unknown outside the left. And as the only successful socialist revolution in history, understanding the Russian Revolution, who drove it, what it achieved, and how it ultimately failed and degenerated into Stalinism is essential knowledge for any revolutionary. But the German Revolution and its failure was just as decisive in the course of modern history, I would say. You could call them twin revolutions in the sense that what happened in Germany determined the fate of the October Revolution in Russia, because despite Russia's small but militant working class, it was economically backward. It had only recently emerged from feudalism. Lost my spot. And that's unlike Germany, which was one of the wealthiest and most industrialised countries in the world. Russia didn't have the highly developed level of production to support a socialist economic system. Leading Bolsheviks like Trotsky and Lenin had argued from early on that any revolution in Russia would have to spread to Germany and then internationally to be successful, which Luxemburg was also aware of. And this internationalist approach was the polar opposite of Stalin's eventual aim of socialism in one country. In January 1918, Lenin put it very simply: without revolution in Germany, we are doomed. But that year there was every reason for hope that this revolution would happen, not only in Germany but globally. Between 1917 and 1920 there were uprisings, rebellions and mass strikes of workers and soldiers in Italy, France, Belgium, Sweden, Holland, Hungary, Malta, Spain, Britain, Ireland, Egypt, Iran, Canada and Australia, to name just a few. The uprisings were in response to the First World War, to the mass deprivation and political repression at home, and the industrial scale slaughter on the front. And in colonised nations like Egypt, it was also against imperial domination. And despite what we learn in school about how the war ended when the leaders of Germany and the Allied powers decided to call it a day, sign a treaty in Versailles, it was these uprisings that actually made it impossible to continue the First World War. So after a year or so, the initial enthusiasm for the war had begun to wane in all the warring nations. There were massive shortages of food and basic goods. Wartime restrictions on political freedoms intensified, and it became clear that the war, which was being fought in freezing, muddy, rat and lice-infested trenches, and people had been told it was only going to go on for a few months before victory, was likely to go on for years. Strikes and protests started back up, and parties like the Bolsheviks, where Lenin had long opposed the war and argued for revolutionary defeatism, began to get a serious hearing amongst soldiers and workers. The Bolsheviks had faced repression for their anti-war agitation, and Lenin and Trotsky went into hiding or exile multiple times, but crucially, because they'd been building the Bolshevik Party on the basis of revolutionary principles since as early as 1903, they had members in all the major cities and workplaces in Russia, and increasingly amongst soldiers who could carry the arguments against Tsarism and against war. Luxemburg and others like Karl Liebknecht, Paul Froelich and Clara Zetkin, who had also opposed the war, found they also had space to agitate and organise once again in Germany. The difference here, though, was that outside of Luxemburg and Liebknecht's small circle of revolutionaries, which had remained within the SPD, there wasn't an experienced party to carry their arguments in the class. which is a particularly difficult situation when Luxemburg was locked up for almost a year in jail for her stance. There were other revolutionary groupings in different cities like Bremen and Stuttgart, but they only sporadically organised together, not as a single organisation. When the SPD had supported the war in 1914, Luxemburg had held meetings in her house every night for a week with a handful of other anti-war members to discuss how to campaign against the war within and outside the party, but they still didn't break with the party at that time. They only operated as a kind of radical faction within it. Even Karl Liebknecht, who ended up being being her closest collaborator and had always opposed the war, had initially been forced by party discipline to vote for the war credits in Parliament. It was only once their faction got more organised that he was the only one in Parliament to vote against it. And the terrible irony, I think, is that Luxemburg had been railing against the SPD's slide towards reformism for over a decade before the war. In the early 1900s, there was a division opening up between the trade union bureaucracy that didn't want the strikes to get out of control or put too much pressure on the economy, and the rank and file who were becoming more militant and looking for more radical methods. And the classic division within reformism between economics and politics emerged at this time, with the SPD-affiliated unions carrying out strikes over industrial issues but not taking up political questions, and the party saying that political questions should be dealt with in Parliament. The leaders were reluctant to support strikes if they thought it would affect their chances of election, which sounds very familiar to all of us in the room, I think, with the Labour Party and the like. The SPD leader Edouard David put it very clearly in 1906 after a wave of strikes had subsided. He said, "The brief May flowering of revolution is happily over. The party will again devote itself with undivided heart to the expansion of its parliamentary power." And actually Lenin, who was in constant contact with Luxemburg, hadn't believed her assertions about the SPD leadership's slide to the right until they supported the war. He said, "Rosa Luxemburg was right. She realised long ago that Kautsky was a time-serving theorist who wants to deaden the awakening consciousness of the workers. And this is when Luxemburg wrote her pamphlet called The Mass Strike, about how economic struggles often and very easily flow into political questions and vice versa, and they can't be separated. And I think it's the role of the Revolutionary Party to bring the two back together. We see this today with things like the right to strike, where workers who want to fight inevitably come up against our anti-union laws, or where fighting for women's equality is also dependent on them being able to strike for higher wages, for example. She had observed this happening spontaneously in workers' struggle, and it reaffirmed her commitment to the idea that workers themselves could and must be the agents of their own liberation, which is a key principle of our tradition. But she was mistaken in the level of faith that she put in the spontaneity of the working class, I think. And she expressed a fear that a disciplined revolutionary party like Lenin's Bolsheviks could stifle the spontaneity and life of the working class. While it's true that workers can and do fight without the presence of revolutionaries all the time, it's not a foregone conclusion either that they'll win those struggles or that they'll have the answers to the political questions they face. As workers organising in their separate workplaces, they often lack the overview of the capitalist system and the conditions in which they're fighting, and organised connections to other workplaces that a revolutionary organisation can bring. And another very frustrating irony, she even explained the need for the party in Russia with almost perfect clarity when she said that unlike workers in the heat of struggle, the party rises above every particular moment of the struggle because it has a final aim that goes beyond all particular moments, which for that reason does not see the end of the world in immediate success or failure of the moment. Which I think, those of us who have been in Solidarity for a long time, who have seen many things fail, but know that we can redeploy our efforts and learn the lessons from those struggles to bring them to new fights. Unfortunately, she didn't generalise this clarity to the situation in Germany, where it was becoming clear that the SPD leaders no longer had the final aim of revolution, only of representing the working class within German capitalism. When mass strikes broke out in Germany in 1905, the year of the first revolution in Russia, she saw the need for revolutionaries to be in a position to lead the struggle, saying the party and its union leaders had a choice between placing itself at the head of the flood or being swept aside by it. But even in this formulation, I think there is a problem, because once the flood of struggle breaks out, especially in a revolutionary situation, revolutionaries can't just place themselves at the head of it and say, we're leading this now. They've got to be part of it from the start, from the very start, not just as a layer of intellectuals that are outside of and separate to the class, but inside it, with members in all key industries and cities who could not just lead strikes, but argue to take them further and develop into political struggles against war, against imperialism, against the German monarchy, and so on. She also thought that breaking with the SPD would mean no longer having access to its mass base of workers. But this ended up being a huge disadvantage and point of confusion, particularly when workers were themselves coming to oppose the war and associated the SPD with support for the war. The fact that the SPD leaders often spoke in the language of socialism and revolution, while in reality they did everything that they could to rein in that movement, confused things further. I think if there had been a clearly distinct party that won a layer of workers to a revolutionary strategy and to opposition to the war years before, when it was still a minority view, they could have been in a position to lead their fellow workers when the mass strikes and the mutinies broke out of their own accord. Such a party could have carried Luxemburg and Leibniz's arguments within the class and be easily distinguishable from the pro-war reformists. So after 1915, workers did rally behind them in bigger and bigger numbers, but what they really needed were 1,000 or 1,000,000 Luxemburgs and Leibniz inside the factories and the platoons. I'm just going to have a sip of water before I start on the actual revolution. Okay, so by that year, 1915, the brutal war was unpopular enough that a section of MPs in the SPD turned against it. They were expelled from the party after voting against more war credits, and they established the independent SPD, or the USPD, which Luxemburg and her allies joined as a faction which called itself the Spartacus League. The USPD quickly gained a following of tens of thousands of the most radical workers, but apart from the question of war and opposing the war, their leadership was still, the leadership of the USPD was still committed to the same politics of reformism, had no interest in revolution. And the Spartacus had missed another crucial opportunity in that moment to break completely with the reformists and form their own party. So in 1917, discontent with the war grew into full-blown rebellions in many countries. There were mutinies on the battlefront, mass protests against food rationing, repression, and mass strikes brought war production to a standstill at various points. This anti-war rebellion reached its zenith, as we know, in Russia. First with the February Revolution, which was started by women workers in St. Petersburg that overthrew the Tsar, the Russian monarchy, who was replaced by a provisional bourgeois democratic government of the kind that we're familiar with, and then the October Revolution, which is actually November in our calendar, but was a different Russian calendar, when power was seized by the workers and soldiers Soviets. The Bolsheviks had played a crucial role in the months between February and November. Through these months in Russia, there was a situation of what's called dual power, where the Soviets, which had democratically elected councils of workers, had control in the factories, and also soldiers, Soviets on the front lines. They effectively held economic power, so in the factories, in the cities, and so on. But the bourgeois government still held the political power of the state, sitting in the parliament. And when it became clear that the new government was still committed to the war and wouldn't deliver on the February demand for bread, land, and peace, Lenin and the Bolsheviks argued for all power to the Soviets. That was the line that they went into the October Revolution with. So through this and a whole series of other political battles in that year, they won leadership across most of the Soviets and led them to seize political power in November. And the first act of that new Soviet state was to withdraw from the war. This withdrawal process was also a long and torturous process that I don't have time to go into, but the Russian Communist Party, as the Bolsheviks were now called, immediately set about agitating for withdrawal from the war by the other countries and calling for revolutionary insurrection in other countries. The only place where the depth and breadth of struggle was matched outside Russia was in Germany. A mutiny had broken out in the Navy as early as August 1917. That was quickly suppressed, but after the October Revolution in Russia, its withdrawal from the war, the movement in Germany burst out again in 1918. And I think you can mark the beginning of the German Revolution when sailors in Kiel's naval base mutinied en masse again. So there was mounting mass desertion in the trenches, growing unrest from workers in the city, and the German High Command knew that they could not win the war under these circumstances. And in October that year, 1918, the Kaiser was forced to accept a new government that included SPD members, because Germany's rulers hoped that including the main Workers' Party in the government would placate the movement and allow them to cobble together a peace treaty that kept the monarchy intact. But the British and French, who the Germans had been fighting, seized on the opportunity to push harder against Germany. They wanted total surrender from the Kaiser, the German king, and not a negotiated peace. They wanted to get everything that they could get out of the war. So in a last desperate attempt to avoid a humiliating surrender, the German High Command ordered the Kiel fleet to take on the British, and the Kiel fleet said no. The sailors said no. Sailors in Wilhelmshaven refused to let the ships leave, and the town of Kiel, where a mass meeting of 20,000 people elected a sailors' council, exploded in revolt and gained political control of the whole town. And the same process soon happened in Cuxhaven and Wilhelmshaven. So after this, mutinying soldiers linked up with workers, and they held an armed demonstration of 10,000 people, demanding that 300 soldiers imprisoned for mutiny be freed. And after this march was fired on by a group of officers, the soldiers themselves returned fire, which marks the beginning of turning the demonstration into an armed insurrection. There were marches like this around Germany, and Rosa Luxemburg was actually broken out of prison in one of them when they smashed the doors down. Revolution swept through the other industrial cities, and workers were fighting independently of their union leadership, pushing way beyond what they were willing to fight for. A newspaper in Bavaria described the situation, saying, "No elegant gentleman or well-to-do lady dared show themselves in the streets. Only workers, wage slaves, were to be seen, but they were seen with arms." So a situation of dual power was emerging again in Germany. The ruling class only clung to power in the capital, in Berlin. SPD ministers, through their party's working class roots, thought that their party would be able to hold back the revolt. And the German High Command, the army heads, thought that the loyal troops and the police could maintain order, but they were in for an absolute shock. Soon after this, Karl Liebknecht issued a leaflet calling for revolution in Berlin, but he did this without coordinating it with the other cities in Germany. And the Berlin revolt was led by Liebknecht, the other Spartacists, and the revolutionary shop stewards movement, which was based around metal workers in the city. Tens of thousands of workers in all of Berlin's factories joined a general strike. You had columns of workers and soldiers marching through the streets, and they seized the Imperial Palace and seized the police headquarters, which is pretty cool. And on the 9th of November, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. He handed over political power to the only person he thought would have sufficient authority to hold back the masses. That was the SPD leader, Friedrich Ebert. And in the space of 2 hours, Ebert first declared the abolition of the monarchy and the start of the German Republic. 2 hours later, Liebknecht proclaimed a free socialist republic and called for an armed revolution. And the armistice that officially ended World War I was signed 2 days later. So in this situation, the monarchy's gone, but the old ruling class, the generals, the bosses, the rest of it are still in power. They're determined to regain control. And in this moment, the future of the revolution hung in the balance. The question was, would the movement go the way of Liebknecht's declaration or of Ebert's? And although workers' councils like the Soviets in Russia had taken control in factories all over the country, they never made a bid to take political power from the existing German state. The SPD had absolutely no interest in letting this happen. They called for the power of these workers' councils to be invested in a representative parliamentary group that was made up by their own members. The Spartacists and the revolutionary shop stewards were not organised enough to change this situation and didn't have enough coordination between cities. They, in these last few weeks, they regrouped as the German Communist Party. They launched a new paper, the Red Flag, to carry their arguments for revolution, but even amongst themselves, they lacked clarity. They were arguing amongst themselves throughout these few weeks. And the ruling class took this chance during the confusion and the power vacuum to launch a vicious counter-offensive. The SPD government and the German High Command organised a new paramilitary force called the Freikorps to restore order. The Freikorps were made up of middle-class officers and shock troops who were loyal to the old monarchy and bitter about losing the war. They waged a campaign of absolute terror against the left and the workers' movement when they were unleashed. And when Liebknecht had launched another uprising in Berlin in January 19, and he did so without consulting Luxemburg, it was crushed. So Luxemburg had seen that it was, that the working class was not ready for it, they weren't prepared for it, but she wasn't going to let it happen without her being there to fight alongside the workers. And it was that uprising was crushed. And after that, the SPD actually ordered the murder of Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and their bodies were thrown into the River Spree in the middle of Germany. So after this counter-offensive, the working class revolted over and over again. As I said, right up to 1924. I don't have time to explain all the different parts of that, but despite this, the militancy, the bravery of German workers, with their best leaders murdered and the Communist Party unable to take the lead, none of these revolts were able to take power, and the revolution was ultimately defeated. And the second half of the 1920s in Germany, which culminated in the Great Depression, was utterly brutal. There was mass poverty across the country and a generation of men and people destroyed by the war. And the Freikorps that had murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht and that the SPD had helped to create, they became the nucleus for what would become Hitler's National Socialists, which the divided German left was unable to defeat. And so I'm going to finish with some of Luxemburg's last written words that she wrote right before she died. The leadership has failed. Even so, the leadership can and must be recreated from the masses and out of the masses. The masses are the rock on which the final victory of the revolution will be built. Tomorrow, the revolution will raise itself with a rattle and announce with fanfare to your terror, I was, I am, I shall be. And she was right, I think, to say that the masses all over the world would rise again and again. They've done so with or without a revolutionary party, but to ensure the victory of the uprisings that will inevitably come, that we have seen around the world, even in the last few years, I think we need to build a revolutionary party in the here and now that's capable of leading those rebellions to victory.